Getting counterpicked in the top lane and having that impossibly frustrating game where it feels like you can't do anything has probably had you questioning why you play this game at all, right? Darius running you down if you go for a last hit, or tower diving you with his jungler when it's time to finally get that CS, while also being flamed by your team. Yeah, hitting Alt F4 to farm Torghast sounds more interesting than that. But it doesn't have to be that way in any game below Diamond, and we sent one of our players into low platinum elo with the mission of counterpicking themselves to prove it. In this guide, we're going to show two of the best ways to deal with counter matchups in the top lane, so you can feel comfortable going into even the worst of matchups that would usually get stomped by and instead actually start winning most of the time. Let's get into it. The first type of counter that we want to bring up is incredibly one-sided laning matchups. These are the counters that feel impossible, where you get demolished if you walk up for a single last hit. Think Cho'Gath versus Darius, where a single misstep and Darius chases you down in lane. Or Garen versus Gangplank, where Gangplank outskills you by pressing Q with Grasp of the Undying every time you walk up to last hit. Or a cheesy pick, Olaf versus, well, anyone. You get the point. Any lane where it feels impossible to even interact with your opponent. Let's take a look at a game where we had a Kayle pick into a matchup just like those, versus an Irelia. Just like all those other lanes, this one is ridiculously one-sided during the early game. Kayle is already a fairly weak champion against most top laners, but it's excruciatingly worse in this lane. Since Kayle has no way to contest Irelia from stacking her passive, Irelia can upkeep it permanently. That means it's almost impossible for Kayle to ever walk up, lest she wants to be obliterated. So, let's check out what Kayle does to stay relevant, regardless of these dire circumstances. The easiest way to come out ahead in these lanes is to outplay your opponents with wave control. Just because you're playing Tryndamere and the enemy counterpicks you with Teemo doesn't magically give him the knowledge to play the game properly. Low elo players constantly make terrible decisions with their wave control, and this is what you're going to look to punish. First things first, you have to remain disciplined. During the early lane, you should be totally okay with conceding as much CS as you feel is necessary to remain safe. This is where everyone loses to their counter. They go into the game knowing that they're countered, but in the game they immediately tilt and go in for last hits anyway. It may feel really bad, but you should know that going down 20 or even 30 CS by 8 minutes is actually playing really well, and you should be happy about that. Something we taught before is to remember that CS isn't as big of a deal as one might think. On average, each CS gives around 20 gold. So even if you get denied 20 CS over a period of 8 minutes, you'd only be down around a ruby crystal. Sure, it sucks, but it's not the end of the world. And to be fair, we said average. More often than not, when you're being zoned, you're getting most of the melee last hits and missing the casters. The average gold that you're losing is closer to 14 gold per CS rather than 20, which should make you feel even better about giving up some last hits. Very importantly, there's two guarantees that you get by conceding last hits early on. One, the wave will push toward you since your opponent is hitting it more than you are. That's perfect for staying safe. Number two, you will obviously remain at full health. Health is a resource that you can actually use for some neat wave tactics that we'll show you in a bit. Giving up those early CS will get you more farm in the long run if you're patient. We do want to acknowledge that there is one clear downside to playing this safe. You're allowing your opponent to build big crashes and potentially dive you with their jungler. That's where your discipline comes in. It's very difficult to dive full HP champions. You should be fine as long as you're not taking too much damage. Yes, there are exceptions, like the infamous Renekton Elise duo who will dive you from 100 to 0 instantly. Versus lanes like those, you'd want stuff like the Bone Plating rune to fend off the dive as much as you can. Alright, Kayle has safely reached the point where the wave is finally crashing near her tower. What do you think you should be looking to do if you're the Kayle in this situation? If you said to leash the wave, you're 100% correct. This won't always be possible, but like we said, players have fairly bad wave control at lower elos. Remember how we said that preserving your health in the long run can be beneficial? Well, this is exactly where it can come in clutch. Kayle can now use some of it to keep the lane in this safe spot for an even longer period of time. Notice how Irelia's earlier push was getting thinned by the tower. This is the sign of a poor crash. You definitely want to look for situations like these where you can leash the wave and punish your opponent's mistake. First, it completely denies any recall timings that this Aurelia was potentially going for. She has to stay since the wave isn't cleanly crashed yet. But again, look at the outcome of Kaele's small leash. The lane continues to be stuck in the perfect place for her to farm safely. This tactic is very potent against melee champions who simply can't harass you effectively when you're under your tower like this. Alright, well done so far, Kaele. Too bad the lane is over anyway and you're about to die. Oh well, nice try I guess. Aurelia managed to crash the wave just enough so that it eventually begins bouncing back toward her. There is literally nothing Kaele can do about this, and it's inevitable since Kaele is in a losing matchup. But as we see moments later, Kaele does us a favor and mentions how Aurelia is being impatient and doing something wrong. Based on what you know, what do you think she's messing up? The issue is the problem so many low elo players face when they play lane bullies. The point of a lane bully is to bully the other champion. When your opponent is playing safe the whole time, it can be easy to get impatient and make poor choices. Remember how the point of Kaele leashing the wave was to keep it closer to her side for safety? Well, Aurelia hitting the wave to try and force a trade on Kaele is a huge mistake. She continues to weaken the push, making the wave stall out on Kaele's side, which just lets her continue to farm safely. If she had waited just a bit, the wave would continue to quickly push into her. In the middle of the lane, Aurelia could abuse the matchup and force trades thanks to a frozen lane state. Not only that, but it also sets up ganks, which she was definitely going to get since everyone wants to shut down Kaele. Aurelia continues making mistakes and shoves the wave to look for a recall instead of setting up her own guaranteed freeze. Once more, Kaele is rewarded with her patience. With all of the health that she's preserved, she can once again leash the wave into yet another uncomfortable position for Aurelia. It was definitely a bit risky to do so, but the payoff is worth it, since Kaele continues to remain completely safe in this lane. Aurelia seems completely tilted that her recall attempts keep getting foiled and attempts to shove yet again at nearly no resources. Kaele looks to punish her overextending and scores a nice kill on her. Just like that, the worst part of this matchup is over and Kaele comes out of this lane phase somehow ahead of the enemy Aurelia. Of course, things won't always go this smoothly. Scoring this kill definitely shouldn't be a part of your game plan. Aurelia made countless mistakes, and Kaele knew her limits quite well, which is why this kill was even possible. That being said, what you should be taking away from this game is the mindset and wave tactics Kaele utilized to stay completely safe throughout the early lane. She was always looking to punish the many mistakes that Aurelia made based on the wave. Needless to say, this clearly won't work after a certain elo range, but you don't need to concern yourself with that. Technically, in high elo, this lane is completely scripted. Aurelia could have just slow pushed the first 3 waves, got a cheater recall, walked back to lane, and set up a permanent freeze. Kaele would be powerless versus the all-ins and ganks Aurelia could force off an early freeze. There is literally nothing Kaele can do in this matchup in high elo when it's played appropriately. But, like we said, that's irrelevant to almost everyone until you reach those higher elo ranges like Diamond and above. And at that point, yeah, maybe you shouldn't blind pick Kaele in top lane. At these lower elo ranges though, punishing wave mistakes is very common and doable in every single matchup. Alright, on to the next type of counter. As a top laner, you should know that one of the things we value most at skill capped is side lane pressure. The easiest way to carry solo queue as a top laner is to be in a side lane, pushing waves into towers, and then rotating toward your team to force a numbers advantage play. And even if that doesn't work, your side lane pressure could just lead to huge farm leads by enabling you to steal enemy jungle camps the whole game. Like we said, side lane pressure is pretty nice, which makes it feel all the worse when you're in a matchup where you know that you'll always lose the side lane 1v1. It's so frustrating knowing that your opponent is going to get to do whatever they want the whole game. Sometimes the answer to this is easier than you may think. For example, let's take a look at this Rumble versus Warwick lane. It's not going too hot for Rumble. He's continuously getting baited by the barrier Warwick cheese and is falling very far behind in this lane. After this death, if you were Rumble, what would you buy to turn this lane around? Some of you may have been thinking something like Oblivion Orb to counter Warwick's healing or Seeker's Arm Guard to stop feeding when behind. But no, Rumble just goes Sork Boots. He's following a very important principle. If you cannot ever win the side lane, then don't bother itemizing for it at all. Sometimes, players can get very tunnel visioned on itemizing for their lane counterpart and completely forget that it's a 5v5 game and unexpected things can occur. Investing a ton of resources into trying to win something that you have no business winning is generally going to be a waste of time. Again, we're also counting on the tendencies that lower elo players tend to follow. People in Platinum and below generally just ARAM a lot of the time, hoping for random skirmishes. More often than not, this just means that the side lane is going to be open anyway, and you don't even need to build counter items to beat them, since they don't know what they should be doing anyway. So, for example, this Quinn game was horrible for her. Malphite is a really frustrating matchup that she countered herself in, and it's only going to get worse once Malphite gets even more armor. And yet, she's still rushing Sanguine Blade. That's because Quinn realizes that it's pointless to commit any resources into dealing with Malphite, and she should just avoid him entirely instead. Getting picks with her team and roaming around with lethality items is much better than trying to ever deal with an unkillable tank. In the Garen game, Camille got super fed and became a life-stealing, mobile-killing machine who was running rampant throughout the game. Garen didn't try to counter it by going Bramble Vest or some armor item to deal with her in the side lane. No, instead, he went Stridebreaker and Black Cleaver so he could actually find his own picks in the side lane as well, and potentially match what she's doing, while still being more useful in teamfights as a meat shield. And like we said, Rumble went raw damage instead of bothering with healing reduction or armor. Despite being behind, he's still doing very relevant damage and is able to pick up kills here and there. There is a common trend in literally all three of these games. In all of them, the player fell behind, but thanks to itemization and proper play, he was still able to come back and be super relevant in the late stages of the game, even in bad matchups. It is definitely due to proper itemization, but also exploiting what your counter matchup is weak against. Yes, there are meta champions and some are stronger than others, but all champions are at least good at something. More importantly, all champions have something that they struggle to do. Warwick may be a really cheesy 1v1 champion that almost no one can duel, but he's really bad at teamfighting. All Rumble had to do was roam around and force fights, and his team was likely to win them due to how much stronger he is compared to Warwick in this situation. Camille has a similar problem. She's a disgusting champion when it comes to getting picks and small skirmishes. Although she's not as bad as Warwick in teamfights, it's still not her forte, and Garen will still be more useful as simply a meat shield for his team. Same thing with Malphite. He may be an unkillable tank with a deadly ultimate, but he doesn't pressure towers that well at all. Quinn was free to leave lane and avoid the 1v1 in favor of looking for picks simply because she knew it would take Malphite forever to even pressure her first tower. It's all about exploiting low elo mistakes and making the best of what your own champion can do and what the enemy champion can't. It won't always be pretty, but that's why they're counter matchups. You gotta get creative in order to come out on top. Anyway, that's going to wrap up this guide. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.